By 1945, the Saders were a well-respected family of first-generation Italian Americans. The head of their family and father, Giorgio Sodu, immigrated to the U.S. at just 13 years old and quickly changed his name to George Sader. An older brother accompanied him as well, but only as far as Ellis Island before the two went their separate ways. After arriving in the U.S., George quickly found work as a railroad laborer in Pennsylvania and eventually moved to West Virginia and founded a successful trucking company. Then, in the early 1920s, he met a young woman named Jenny Cipriani, who'd also been born in Italy. The couple got married 3 years later in 1923 and then moved to Fayetteville, West Virginia, put down roots, and got down to business, starting a family. By all accounts, George was a good father, husband, and provider, but he also had strong opinions about politics and current events, and his views didn't always sit well with other Italian Americans in the town, especially with some of the tumultuous and controversial things occurring across the Atlantic before and during World War II. On the night of December 24th, 1945, George, Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children shared a meal before opening a few presents in celebration of Christmas Eve. After dinner and presents, the family went to bed like any other ordinary evening. Around midnight, the telephone rang, and Jenny thought it might be her son who was in the army, calling to wish everyone Merry Christmas. But when she answered, the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a strange woman who asked Jenny if she could speak to someone she didn't know. Because of the laughter in the background of the caller, Jenny assumed that the woman was at a Christmas party and had dialed the wrong number after one too many drinks. Before returning to the first-floor master bedroom, Jenny noticed that lights were still on and the curtains hadn't been drawn, and that the front door was unlocked. Since one of their children, Marion, was the only one asleep on the living room couch, she figured the other children were already upstairs in bed. So, she closed the curtains, locked the door, turned out the lights, and returned to her own bed. Shortly after dozing off, she thought she heard something heavy hit and roll off the roof. But in that in-between, between waking up and sleeping, it didn't really register how weird that was, so she fell right back asleep after hearing the noise. About 30 minutes later, she was woken up again, but this time by heavy smoke filling their bedroom. George woke up a few seconds later, and already they could barely see or breathe. Since the fire had already swept through the downstairs, they grabbed 2-year-old Sylvia from the crib next to their bed and then ran out of the house. 3 of their kids, 16-year-old George Jr., 17-year-old Marion, and 23-year-old John, were already outside, but 6-year-old Dolly, 8-year-old Jenny, 10-year-old Louise, 12-year-old Martha, and 14-year-old Morris were not outside yet. George immediately ran back to the house and shattered the downstairs window. He then jumped through the window into the inferno, only to find that the flaming staircase was completely impassable. Next, he ran to the side of the house for the ladder so he could use it to rescue his children through a second-floor window, but the ladder was not where he'd last seen it. Next, he tried to drive one of his coal trucks up to the house and enter a second-floor window from the top of the cab, but both trucks wouldn't start, even though they'd been working perfectly the day before. In all of the chaos, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but no one picked up the call. Another neighbor also saw the blaze and called too, but again, no one answered. This same distraught neighbor eventually drove into town and tracked down the fire chief. But even though the firehouse was less than 3 miles away, by the time the crew showed up, approximately 6 hours later, the home had been reduced to ashes. George, Jenny, and the rest of their children could only watch, as they could only assume that the rest of the family was still inside the home. As devastating as this was, though, and weirdly, almost immediately after the fire was finished, they began to have doubts about whether the children were even inside. After searching the rubble, no remains were discovered anywhere. Not even the skeletons were recovered, which is typical in house fires. To top it off, the house had only burned for about an hour, and even the fire chief admitted that it probably hadn't been hot enough to fully cremate 5 bodies. Shortly afterward, a state police investigator stated that the fire was due to faulty wiring, but later, an independent electrician hired by the family discovered that some of the home's electrical wires, Fayetteville Fire and Police departments weren't interested. Instead, the family ended up hiring a private detective named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley would go on to discover that the angry insurance salesman happened to be on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. He also learned that after the fire chief had found what appeared to be a human heart in the ruins of the Sauter home, but had buried it on site and kept the discovery to himself. After tracking him down, the pair dug up the organ in question and took it to a local mortician, who determined that it was a cow's liver that had never been anywhere near a fire. Later, it was discovered that the fire chief had told others that he had bought the liver and buried it in hopes that they'd find it, accept it as proof that their missing children had died in the fire, and then call off their personal investigation. Then, nearly 5 years after the fire, the Sauters also hired a renowned Washington, D.C. pathologist to excavate the site and analyze any items that were recovered. The excavation revealed personal and household items, as well as a few small shards of what were later determined to be human vertebrae. These bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institute, where additional analysis revealed that they were relatively close in age to some of the missing children. However, they showed no evidence of ever being burned. The report also noted how it was odd that no other bones were found, and that in many house fires, whole skeletons were recovered intact. In the end, the report concluded that the bones weren't from the Sauter children, and that they were probably in the dirt that George used to fill the foundation after the fire. These findings prompted 2 hearings at the Capitol in Charleston, but officials still refused to reopen or even re-examine the case. Then, in 1968, Jenny Sauter received a letter that had been postmarked in Kentucky. Inside, she found the photo of a young man with an uncanny resemblance to Lewis, who was just 9 years old on the night of the fire. On the back was a cryptic message that read, "Louis Sauter. I love Brother Frankie. Elil Boys. A 90132 or 35. Despite their fears that publishing the letter might bring harm to the children, they did update the billboard on Route 16 with the new photograph. George then hired another private detective to follow up in the lead in Kentucky, but nothing else was found since the letter had no return address. It's also not even clear if the letter was legitimate or if it was just a prank on a desperate family. Tragically, George Sauter passed away in 1969, never knowing what happened to his missing children. Jenny died 2 decades later, and up until the time of her death she wore black in mourning and remembrance. Now, even the billboard with the faces of the missing children is long gone, but George and Jenny's grandchildren haven't given up the search. Some theorize that the local mafia may have orchestrated the fire and kidnapping after George refused to pay extortion money, or that it was Mussolini loyalists who were retaliating for what they considered his unpatriotic political views. Whatever the case, George and Jenny always maintained that their children were kidnapped by the group of people who started the fire. Of course, though, it's also possible that they might have simply died in the fire after all. It's possible the fire burned far harder than originally thought, and the bones really could have been reduced to ash. Unfortunately, because of how long ago the case occurred and how highly publicized it was, there are so many theories and conflicting accounts. It just makes it all that much more confusing. In any case, I know this case has been covered a bunch before, but since it's so infamous and since this is a new series, I figured it might be good to include. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. This is part of a series, so you might want to check out the other videos in the series. If you want to support the channel, give this video a like, and if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the email found in the description or the Scary Interesting subreddit. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one. In the summer of 2004, on the beautiful Spanish island of Majorca, a bartender stood at a bar going about his day, laughing and joking with the tourists coming for a vacation. Although the bartender wasn't originally from there, he had a nice little life for himself. He had friends and a girlfriend, and as far as a relaxing place to live, it didn't get much better than the island. However, in the next second, the man's life would completely change. Someone walked into the bar, and although the bartender didn't know who they were, they recognized him. This would be the beginning of the end for him. As a child, Mary Goff was always close to her parents and 5 brothers. According to her brother David, she was smart, easygoing, and fun to be around. On the other hand, she was also quieter and more reserved than many girls her age. Mary eventually got a job as a legal secretary in Balbriggan, Ireland, about 20 miles north of Dublin. At the same time, self-employed computer analyst Colin Whelan also lived in Balbriggan, and according to some sources, he knew Mary and her family for years. Up until then, though, they were just casual acquaintances. But that changed one evening in 1993 when they ran into one another at a local pub called the Huntsman Inn. Colin was handsome, driven, and outgoing, and at that point, Mary had never had a boyfriend. Needless to say, she was flattered that he showed her so much attention, and soon they began dating and things got serious almost immediately. And Mary's parents and brothers welcomed Colin into the family with open arms. The couple would break up for a brief spell in 1995, but they got back together and bought a house in 1997. But then, tragedy struck when it looked like everything was falling into place. It's unclear where Colin went or who he was with on the night of Friday, January 31st, 1997, but there was a fair amount of alcohol in his system when he got behind the wheel of his car just before 10 p.m. Shortly thereafter, he was involved in a violent head-on collision with an elderly couple a few miles from town, and tragically, a 61-year-old woman was killed in the accident. Her husband was driving that night, but he and Colin walked away with relatively minor injuries. Afterward, Colin faced drunk driving, and maybe even manslaughter or vehicular homicide charges, and if convicted, he could have spent years behind bars. To Mary, it looked like her once-in-a-lifetime romance was all but over. But, in the end, Colin was only convicted of careless driving. The judge gave him little more than a slap on the wrist, and afterward, he never spoke about the accident to Mary, her family, or anyone else. Mary knew that this hung over him like a dark cloud, but they put it behind them and eventually announced that they were going to tie the knot in September of 2000. Mary worked tirelessly to ensure that no wedding detail got overlooked, because after all, everyone knew it was going to be the most important day of her life. Colin was also busy, but his preparations were far more private in nature. By early 2001, Colin and Mary had only been married for about 6 months, and at least on the outside, they still looked like the quintessential happy newlyweds. But this carefully crafted facade crumbled in dramatic fashion on the night of Wednesday, February 28th, when Colin dialed 999 in a frantic state. He would go in to tell the emergency operator that there had been a terrible accident in his home, and his 27-year-old wife, Mary, was unconscious and bleeding from the nose. When police and EMTs arrived a few minutes later, he was kneeling over Mary at the bottom of the stairs. She was wrapped in a thick comforter, and by then, she'd flatlined. This was immediately more than a little odd, because fall victims rarely experience heart failure. Either way, Mary was rushed to Beaumont Hospital. Colin followed in his car, and they arrived just after midnight the morning of Thursday, March 1st, 2001. Tragically, though, emergency room physicians weren't able to resuscitate Mary, and she was pronounced dead on arrival a few minutes later. When the chaos finally subsided, they noticed that she had marks on her neck and chest that were more consistent with strangulation than a fall down a stairway. In addition, a nurse noticed that Colin had suspicious scratches on his chest. Mary's mother arrived to the hospital shortly after 1 a.m., and at that point, she only knew that her daughter had been injured in a tragic accident. As she ran down the hallway, she saw Colin slumped over on a bench with his head in his hands. When she asked how Mary was, he looked up and said, "She's dead." Mary's family was understandably inconsolable when they arrived at the hospital later that morning. But according to Mary's mother, Colin didn't even show the slightest bit of genuine emotion. And almost right away, detectives were pretty sure that Colin's version of events wasn't entirely accurate. Had been cut before the fire. Unfortunately, they had no idea when they were cut or by who. Then, despite these odd inconsistencies, authorities ruled the fire accidental, and the 5 death certificates issued before the new year all stated the missing children had died in the fire that night. Tragically, if remains had been found, George and Jenny could have had some closure and started putting their broken family back together. Instead, they became increasingly convinced that the children had not been inside the home when the fire occurred, that they might be a lie somewhere still, and that the fire may have been used to cover up a kidnapping. With few options at their disposal, they rented a huge billboard on Route 16 with the names and faces of the missing children, along with a promise to pay $5,000 to anyone with information about their whereabouts. At the same time, Jenny began testing to see if bones actually burned in fires by burning various animal bones to see if she could turn them into ash. And what she found was that no matter how hot the fire got or how long the bones burned, they always remained intact. Jenny even contacted a crematorium and was told that bone fragments often remain even after incineration for 2 hours or more at 2,000 degrees. House fires can get that hot, but it's still different than direct exposure for 2 straight hours. So, with half of his family dead or missing, and far more questions than answers, George tried to preserve the site by filling the basement and foundation with more than 5 feet of dirt. As time went on, rather than feeling about the circumstances, the family began to remember a number of strange events that occurred before December 24th. And these are some seriously strange and confusing events. The first involved a stranger who'd shown up at the house looking for work a few months before. The man had walked to the back of the house, pointed to a fuse box, and said it would probably start a fire someday. George thought it was a particularly strange behavior, since a local utility company representative had just given the home's electrical system a clean bill of health. At about the same time, a traveling insurance salesman stopped by the Sater home and had become enraged when George declined to purchase its policy. Strangely as well, he also predicted the house would go up in smoke, that it would destroy George's children, and that he wouldn't get away with criticizing Italian dictator Mussolini. George was known to not be shy about voicing his dislike of Mussolini, but at the time, he chalked it up to nothing more than a threat made by a frustrated insurance salesman with a big mouth. In another instance, the Sodders' oldest son, Maurice, also remembered seeing a mysterious man in a car parked down the road, watching the younger children walk from home to school. But things got even stranger when the Saters found a charred object in the debris that seemed to resemble a pineapple bomb hand grenade, similar to the ones used by American servicemen in World War II. Upon seeing this object, Jenny recalled hearing the thud on the roof the night of the fire, and wondered if it had been caused by this object. In addition to that, there were also a number of odd sightings reported of the missing children after the incident. The first came from a woman who said she'd saw the missing children, gazing from the window of a passing car, while the Sodders' house was still burning. Another woman said she served the Sodder kids breakfast on Christmas morning at a roadside restaurant near Charleston, West Virginia. Another said 4 of the missing children stayed at a hotel in Charleston about a month after the fire, and they were accompanied by 2 stern men of Italian descent, driving a car with out-of-state plates. The receptionist apparently tried to engage the children in conversation, but after a short burst of Italian from one of the men, the children stopped talking. One time as well, George even thought he saw his missing daughter, Betty, in a newspaper photo of school children in New York City. He drove to Manhattan and apparently located the family, but the girl's parents refused to even speak with him. Shortly after that, a letter arrived from a woman in Missouri who claimed one of the children, Martha, was in a convent in St. Louis. Another tip came from Texas, where a bar patron said he overheard a conversation between 2 men where they were discussing a mysterious Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia years before. In the end, George would follow up on dozens of these leads from across the country, but he always returned to West Virginia empty-handed. 2 years after the fire, the Sodders wrote to the director of FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, asking if he and the Bureau would get involved. He would get a reply, but unfortunately, he stated that the Bureau could only help if local authorities officially request assistance. Unfortunately, for one, the accident looked staged. Mary's body seemed to be in a contrived and unnatural position. In addition, the ligature marks on her neck and the scratches on Colin's chest seemed to indicate a very different altercation. Then, later that day, a state pathologist confirmed that Mary's death had been caused by asphyxiation. The pathologist would also find an abrasion on Mary's back that indicated she'd been dragged across the floor after her death. To investigators, although they didn't have a direct admission, the evidence already seemed to be overwhelming. And incredibly, even more would come out following an investigation. When crime scene technicians searched the home, they found small drops of blood that matched samples taken from Mary during the autopsy. Investigators also dug into Colin's past to get an idea of his personality and the nature of his previous relationships. One former girlfriend said that Colin assaulted her multiple times, even though they dated for only a short time. And later, forensics found evidence of damning internet searches Colin made in the months leading up to his marriage, and a convenient life insurance policy. Prior to getting married, he took out a £200,000 life insurance policy on his soon-to-be wife. And interestingly, he'd received the double payment, or £400,000 if she died within 10 years of their wedding day. Colin also did dozens of internet searches using phrases like loss of consciousness, strangulation, and asphyxiation. Even more disturbingly, he downloaded a transcript from a case in the United States in which serial offender, Henry Louis Wallace, did this to nearly a dozen women and wrapped some of their bodies in a comforter to delay the natural cooling process. Initially, when he was asked why he wrapped Mary in a comforter on the night she died, Colin claimed that the 999 operator instructed him to do it because it would keep her warm. But he apparently didn't know that 999 calls were recorded, so when investigators listened to the audio and reviewed the transcript, it was clear that the operator never gave many such instructions. By then, the operating theory was that Colin murdered Mary in their bedroom. Then he dragged her body down the stairs, staged it on the landing, and wrapped it in a comforter just like Henry Louis Wallace. Colin was then arrested, charged with murder, and transported to Dublin's notorious Clover Hill prison in April of 2001. Surprisingly, though, he was eventually released on bond, but to prevent him from fleeing, he had to surrender his passport and check in at the police station near his home every day while awaiting his trial, which was scheduled to begin in October of 2003. This 2-year delay gave Colin more freedom and breathing room than most defendants charged with such serious crimes. And for Mary's family, the waiting was absolutely unbearable. There was no guarantee that Colin would be convicted, and in the meantime, he was essentially a free man while they struggled to put their broken lives back together. In the early going, Colin worked with his attorneys, but by the spring of 2003 it was clear that the case against him was about as airtight as it possibly could be. Then, in March of that year, he disappeared without a trace. A few days later, his vehicle, clothes, and a few personal items were found at Howth Head on a towering cliff overlooking the Irish Sea. It initially looked like he cracked under the pressure and decided to end things on his own accord. At the same time, though, investigators had a suspicion that the same type of person who would potentially murder their wife would also be capable of staging their own passing. This was confirmed later when they discovered that he managed to get a new passport using a neighbor's name. 1,500 kilometers away, Colin was working as a bartender at a popular resort on the Spanish island of Majorca. By all accounts, he led a comfortable and fun-filled life there for more than a year. He made new friends, met tourists from all over the world, and even had a serious girlfriend. He told everyone that his parents were dead, that he didn't have any brothers or sisters, and that he'd probably never return to the country of his birth. By then, keeping his head down and blending in with the crowd had become second nature. Colin's luck eventually ran out in the summer of 2004, when an Irish tourist familiar with Mary's death called the Irish police after recognizing him at the bar. With the help of the Spanish police, the 33-year-old was then arrested and flown back to Ireland in handcuffs a few weeks later. Colin pleaded guilty when his trial finally got underway at the Central Criminal Court in the spring of 2005. During the trial, he wore a dark suit, remained emotionless, and never took the stand in his own defense. In fact, the only time he spoke was to confirm his identity. The prosecution would go on to call a string of witnesses, including the detectives who worked the case, as well as the medical examiner who performed the autopsy shortly after Mary's death. Their testimony was especially surprising to Mary's family, because they weren't aware that Colin planned her murder, or that he bought the life insurance policy months before they were married. Near the end of the trial, his defense attorney read a statement to Mary's mother and the rest of her family that apparently was written by Colin himself. It's unclear why Colin didn't read it himself, but whatever the case, he apologized for killing Mary and said that he'd live with the horrible regret and sorrow for the rest of his life. Needless to say, the statement came across as insincere. Afterward, Mary's mother addressed Colin in the court before the sentence was handed down. According to her, the one glaring mistake in her daughter's tragically short life was that she fell in love with Colin. As for his lukewarm apology, she claimed that he was only sorry that he got caught and that his charm life in Majorca came to an abrupt end. But later, she told the press that being a grieving mother and attending to her sons was hard enough, and that she just didn't have the time or energy to hold a grudge against him. Colin was then convicted and sentenced to life in prison. True to form, he remained stoic as his sentence was read. September 24th, 1971 was the last day at the time 16-year-old Kathy Marie Moulton was seen. Kathy planned to attend a dance during that night in her hometown of Portland, Maine. She asked her father to drop her off on Cumberland Avenue that evening. Kathy wanted to purchase a pair of pantyhose and some toothpaste before preparing for the dance. She stopped by a music store on Forest Avenue later in the day to visit a friend. She told her friend she would see her at the dance that evening, and then said she was going to walk home, which was about 1.5 miles away. She was last seen walking down Forest Avenue after leaving the music store, and she was seen carrying a brown leather Mexican clutch purse, which contained her house key, 2 tubes of toothpaste, and a very small amount of cash. When she didn't arrive home by dinner time, her parents knew something was wrong and reported her missing. Kathy was seen in a stolen blue Cadillac with her friend named Lester Everett. Though it is possible that Kathy willingly left with him, there were reported sightings of Kathy Lester and another young man in a remote area of Aroostook, Duke County. A few weeks after her disappearance, the second young man was Ronald Reed Purley. However, Lester was eventually found alone, and he claimed to not know where Kathy was. A garage employee at Fort Fairfield in Aroostook County remembered seeing Kathy Lester and Ronald. They came to the garage to buy new tires for the Cadillac. The employees said Ronald appeared to be controlling Kathy's movements, even walking her to and from the bathroom with his hand on the back of her neck across the border on the Topeka Reserve. Witnesses said they saw Lester and Kathy for a few days in September 1971 before the two went to a farm in the Mars Hill area of Aroostook County, where they started working on a potato field at McBride's farm. Kathy was completely distrusting of Lester and continually begged to go back home to Portland, which he refused. Kathy befriended a teenage girl who worked on the fields. The girl said Kathy was nervous about her parents being upset with her and that they were probably looking for her. According to the girl, Kathy also cried often and seemed fearful of the other men working on the farm. She often said she wanted to go home. Lester became tired of Kathy's constant complaining to go home. So, on the evening of September 29, 1971, while the other field workers were enjoying a bonfire, Lester got behind the wheel of the stolen car with Kathy in the passenger seat, told her that they were going for a ride. He begged him to drive her back home, but he didn't. Lester returned the next morning and said that he had dropped her off at another camp when, in reality, he had brought her back across the Canadian border to the Topeka Reserve and left her with Ronald at the end of the potato harvest. Lester and a few others left for Florida to pick oranges. He never returned to Maine, and when questioned, he said he did not know what happened to Kathy Lester, died of cancer in the mid-1980s at the age of 35. Ronald, who had served time for rape and home invasion, has long been a prime suspect in this investigation. He has refused to cooperate with police, even when he was offered immunity from prosecution. If he would provide details as to what happened to Kathy, investigators have considered the possibility that Kathy was killed by Lester and that he left her body in the woods of Aroostook County. But this theory is unlikely, since some of Ronald's relatives would later verify the fact that Lester had dropped her off at their home, and they would claim that one of their relatives had harmed her. It's unknown if this is what happened. His family has refused to cooperate with police about Kathy as well. Investigators believe she died on the Toby Reserve sometime before Thanksgiving of 1971, but they never had enough evidence to file charges against anybody or even get warrants to search Ronald's family home. In 1983, a hunter said he came across a skeleton in the woods near Smyrna, Maine, surrounded by female clothing. Some investigators believe the remains were Kathy's. The hunter was unable to retrace his footsteps and led police back to the site, however, and the bones were never seen again. Kathy was a junior at Deering High School at the time of her disappearance, and her peers said she seemed like a happy girl with no reason to run away from home. Her father died in 2017, but her mother is still alive and continues to hope for a resolution in her case. September 24, 1971 was the last day at the time 16-year-old Kathy Marie Moulton was seen. Kathy planned to attend a dance during that night in her hometown of Portland, Maine. She asked her father to drop her off on Cumberland Avenue that evening. Kathy wanted to purchase a pair of pantyhose and some toothpaste before preparing for the dance. She stopped by a music store on Forest Avenue later in the day to visit a friend. She told her friend she would see her at the dance that evening, and then said she was going to walk home, which was about 1.5 miles away. She was last seen walking down Forest Avenue after leaving the music store, and she was seen carrying a brown leather Mexican clutch purse which contained her house key, 2 tubes of toothpaste and a very small amount of cash. When she didn't arrive home by dinner time, her parents knew something was wrong and reported her missing. Kathy was seen in a stolen blue Cadillac with her friend named Lester Everett. Though it is possible that Kathy willingly left with him, there were reported sightings of Kathy Lester and another young man in a remote area of Aroostook, Duke County. A few weeks after her disappearance, the second young man was Ronald Reed Purley. However, Lester was eventually found alone, and he claimed to not know where Kathy was. A garage employee at Fort Fairfield in Aroostook County remembered seeing Kathy Lester and Ronald. They came to the garage to buy new tires for the Cadillac. The employee said Ronald appeared to be controlling Kathy's movements, even walking her to and from the bathroom with his hand on the back of her neck across the border on the Topeka Reserve. Witnesses said they saw Lester and Kathy for a few days in September 1971 before the two went to a farm in the Mars Hill area of Aroostook County, where they started working on a potato field at McBride's farm. Kathy was completely distrusting of Lester and continually begged to go back home to Portland, which he refused. Kathy befriended a teenage girl who worked on the fields. The girl said Kathy was nervous about her parents being upset with her and that they were probably looking for her. According to the girl, Kathy also cried often and seemed fearful of the other men working on the farm. She often said she wanted to go home. Lester became tired of Kathy's constant complaining to go home. So, on the evening of September 29, 1971, while the other field workers were enjoying a bonfire, Lester got behind the wheel of the stolen car with Kathy in the passenger seat, told her that they were going for a ride. He begged him to drive her back home, but he didn't. Lester returned the next morning and said that he had dropped her off at another camp when, in reality, he had brought her back across the Canadian border to the Topeka Reserve and left her with Ronald at the end of the potato harvest. Lester and a few others left for Florida to pick oranges. He never returned to Maine, and when questioned, he said he did not know what happened to Kathy Lester, died of cancer in the mid-1980s at the age of 35. Ronald, who had served time for rape and home invasion, has long been a prime suspect in this investigation. He has refused to cooperate with police even when he was offered immunity from prosecution. If he would provide details as to what happened to Kathy, investigators have considered the possibility that Kathy was killed by Lester and that he left her body in the woods of Aroostook County. But this theory is unlikely, since some of Ronald's relatives would later verify the fact that Lester had dropped her off at their home, and they would claim that one of their relatives had harmed her. It's unknown if this is what happened. His family has refused to cooperate with police about Kathy as well. Investigators believe she died on the Toby Reserve sometime before Thanksgiving of 1971, but they never had enough evidence to file charges against anybody or even get warrants to search Ronald's family home. In 1983, a hunter said he came across a skeleton in the woods near Smyrna, Maine, surrounded by female clothing. Some investigators believe the remains were Kathy's. The hunter was unable to retrace his footsteps and led police back to the site, however, and the bones were never seen again. Kathy was a junior at Deering High School at the time of her disappearance, and her peers said she seemed like a happy girl with no reason to run away from home. Her father died in 2017, but her mother is still alive and continues to hope for a resolution in her case.